Welcome to Liberation Lens, where stories unfold beyond the headlines and perspective truly matters. History isn't finished, it's unfolding. This is Liberation Lens. Perspective matters.
This is Liberation Lens, Perspective Matters. Today we peel back the polished mask of international diplomacy to expose a hidden architecture of global control. We unpack a story of power cloaked in peace, diplomacy wielded like a sword, and the double standards that define global nuclear politics. We look at a world where the same weapon is called a deterrent in one nation's hands, and a threat in another's. A world where the ability to enrich uranium can either crown you a sovereign, or condemn you a pariah. From Tehran to Tel Aviv, Washington to Vienna, and Pretoria to Pyongyang, we ask, who really gets to own the bomb? Who gets to define the meaning of peace, threat, and war? And what does it mean when one nation's pursuit of sovereignty is branded as a threat, while another's arsenal is treated as security? How did nuclear weapons, born of war and catastrophe, become the preserve of a few and the pretext to dominate the many? This is not simply a question of technology or treaties. It is a question of global justice, racialized power, and post-colonial resistance. Because when one nation's quest for energy and sovereignty becomes a global crisis, while another's secret arsenal is met with silence, we are not witnessing nuclear diplomacy. We are witnessing nuclear apartheid. A system of control dressed in the language of security. A hierarchy of nations and races, enforced through surveillance, sanctions, and propaganda. And a weapon not just of mass destruction, but of mass deception. In this episode, we expose how the nuclear order reflects and reinforces the legacies of colonialism, the strategic racism embedded in global governance, and the long shadow of Western empire disguised as non-proliferation. So buckle up. Because this isn't just a documentary. It's a reckoning. This is Liberation Lens. Because history must be decolonized, power must be questioned, and perspective always matters. Let us begin with the promise of non-proliferation. The Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPT, signed in 1968, entered into force in 1970, was heralded as a tool for global peace. But behind the diplomacy of disarmament by nuclear powers, and equal access to peaceful nuclear technology for others, was a promise never fulfilled. For countries in the global south, particularly Iran, the NPT became less a guarantee and more a trap. Let's now look at Iran, a case of containment and contradiction. Iran joined the NPT in 1970. It has never officially pursued a nuclear bomb, as affirmed by US intelligence and IAEA reports. So why is it treated like a global threat? Note that the origin of its nuclear program was within the Atoms for Peace program launched by US President Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1953. The Atoms for Peace program shared nuclear technology with allies, including Iran, for peaceful purposes. So, Iran signed the NPT on July 1, 1968, and ratified the treaty 2 years later, in 1970 under the leadership of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. However, with US and European assistance, Iran began developing nuclear energy under the Atoms for Peace program in the 1970s. The Bushehr nuclear reactor was built in cooperation with German and later Russian engineers. However, US support for Iran's nuclear ambitions ended with the 1979 Islamic Revolution that kicked out the Shah, declared a Western puppet. The change in leadership meant a change in global narrative, the rise of sanctions, sabotage, for example, using the Stuxnet virus, and the assassinations of Iran's nuclear scientists. Stuxnet was a highly sophisticated cyber weapon discovered in 2010, believed to be jointly developed by the United States and Israel to sabotage Iran's nuclear program. Since then, Iran has found itself navigating a persistent cycle of geopolitical tensions, marked by allegations of covert operations, intensified scrutiny, and escalating sanctions that have shaped its international relations. Then came JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is now the broken deal. In 2015, Iran and world powers signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Iran agreed to limit its program under strict verification. JCPOA limited Iran's uranium enrichment to 3.67% purity, far below weapons-grade levels. It restricted Iran's centrifuge count to 5,060 IR-1 centrifuges, preventing rapid nuclear advancement. It allowed strict inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, to monitor compliance. But what happened when Trump became 45th President of the United States on January 20, 2017? He exited JCPOA on May 8, 2018, citing concerns over Iran's regional activities, unilaterally collapsing the deal. He reimposed economic sanctions, targeting Iran's oil, banking, and financial sectors, severely impacting its economy. He launched the Maximum Pressure campaign, aiming to force Iran into a broader renegotiation, but failed to halt Iran's nuclear advancements. Note that the EU opposed Trump's decision and attempted to preserve the deal, but faced difficulties due to US secondary sanctions on Iran. Therefore, INSTEX, Instrument in Support of Trade Exchanges, was created by France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, E3, on January 31, 2019 to facilitate legitimate trade with Iran while bypassing US sanctions. Nonetheless, it failed to facilitate meaningful trade with Iran. Then, Iran gradually violated JCPOA terms, citing lack of economic relief, leading to further diplomatic tensions. But how does Iran's treatment contrast with others? Let's look at the elephant in the room, Israel's undeclared arsenal. Note that Israel has never signed the NPT. It has nuclear weapons, refuses inspections, and yet faces no sanctions. Why then the silence? Here with some facts. Israel's Dimona nuclear facility was developed in secrecy during the late 1950s and early 1960s, with French assistance. It was initially described as a textile factory to conceal its true purpose. It became operational between 1962 and 1964, producing plutonium for nuclear weapons. Israel's nuclear warhead estimates, CPRI, vary widely, ranging from 80 to 400 nuclear warheads. Note that she maintains a policy of nuclear ambiguity, neither confirming nor denying its arsenal. She is believed to have air, land, and sea-based nuclear delivery systems, including Jericho missiles and Dolphin-class submarines. Under the policy of strategic ambiguity, Western nations, particularly the US and European allies, have avoided pressuring Israel to disclose its nuclear capabilities. This policy allows Israel to maintain deterrence without formal acknowledgement. The EU has debated diplomatic pressure on Israel regarding its nuclear program but has taken no concrete action. Besides, the world has stayed silent to Israel's Begin Doctrine, established by Prime Minister Menahem Begin after Operation Opera, 1981, which destroyed Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor. This justifies preemptive strikes against hostile nations developing weapons of mass destruction. The doctrine was applied again in 2007 with Operation Outside the Box, targeting Syria's Al-Kibar nuclear facility. So, based on the cases of Iran and Israel, how would you regard sanctions and sovereignty? Doesn't the ambiguity point to the notion of new colonialism in the case of Iran? Sanctions are not neutral. They are instruments of geopolitical coercion, often disguised as tools for peace. For Iran, they've meant economic strangulation. Let's look at the impact on medicine, oil exports, banking. Sanctions have severely restricted Iran's ability to import essential medicines, leading to shortages of life-saving drugs, particularly for cancer, hemophilia, and rare diseases. The oil sector, Iran's primary source of revenue, has been crippled by sanctions, reducing exports and forcing Tehran to rely on shadow banking networks to bypass restrictions. Iran's banking system has been largely cut off from SWIFT, making international transactions difficult and limiting access to foreign reserves. On human cost, inflation, unemployment, and infant mortality, sanctions have fueled hyperinflation, causing the Iranian rial to lose significant value, making basic goods unaffordable for many citizens. Unemployment rates have surged, particularly among young Iranians, as foreign investment dries up and businesses struggle under financial restrictions. Infant mortality rates have been affected by shortages in medical supplies and prenatal care, exacerbating health crises among vulnerable populations. Look at other case examples of what sanctions can do. US sanctions have crippled oil production, leading to severe shortages of food and medicine, with estimates suggesting tens of thousands of deaths due to economic hardship in Venezuela. In North Korea, decades of sanctions are reported to have isolated the country, worsening food insecurity and forcing the regime to rely on illicit trade networks to sustain its economy. Regarding Sudan, sanctions have contributed to economic stagnation, limiting access to foreign aid and investment, exacerbating poverty and political instability. Why then shouldn't we refer to this as nuclear apartheid in relation to race, region, and power? What we are witnessing is not just policy, it is ideology. A system where Euro-American powers and allies are privileged, and global South nations are policed. The concept of nuclear apartheid, coined by scholar Zia Mian, a physicist and nuclear policy expert, is used to describe the unequal global nuclear order. It highlights how Western powers dictate nuclear policy, allowing certain nations to maintain nuclear arsenals while blocking others from developing nuclear capabilities. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, reinforces this divide, as nuclear-armed states retain their weapons while restricting access for others. The global North, including the US, Europe, and allied nations, enjoys nuclear privileges, often justified under the guise of security and deterrence. Meanwhile, global South nations, such as Iran, North Korea, and India, before 1998, face sanctions, diplomatic isolation, or military threats when pursuing nuclear technology. This divide reflects historical colonial power structures, where Western nations dictate who can and cannot possess nuclear capabilities. The question is, why are global South countries demonized for asserting technological independence? When they develop advanced technology, they are often framed as threats rather than sovereign innovators. Iran's nuclear program, for example, is portrayed as a danger, while Israel's undeclared nuclear arsenal is ignored or protected. The West's control over technological narratives ensures that scientific progress in the global South is met with suspicion rather than support. Consequently, Iran's nuclear saga reveals a deeper truth. The world order is not based on justice, but control. And the weaponization of nuclear policy is a mirror of how empire functions. What this means is that the global South has historically faced barriers to nuclear development, often dictated by Western-led non-proliferation frameworks. Countries like South Africa, Brazil, and India have had to navigate geopolitical pressures when asserting nuclear independence. South Africa's case is even more revealing. We will handle it in a different documentary. The West's selective enforcement of nuclear policy reinforces economic and technological dependency, limiting sovereign decision-making. This poses a huge problem, the danger of accepting Western definitions of peace, security, and legitimacy. They often define peace and security in ways that justify intervention while restricting autonomy for non-aligned nations. The legitimacy of nuclear capability is framed through Euro-American interests, allowing Israel, the US, and allies to maintain arsenals while policing others. Accepting these definitions reinforces a hierarchy where Western nations dictate global security norms, sidelining alternative governance models. This is not acceptable. And explains why Iran is a symbol of resistance and warning. Iran's nuclear stance represents a symbol of resistance and warning, a challenge to Western-imposed limits, asserting sovereignty despite sanctions and isolation. Its defiance has made it a target for economic warfare, demonstrating how nuclear policy is weaponized to control dissent. On the other hand, Western sanctions and pressure on Iran is meant to serve as a warning to other nations seeking technological independence, highlighting the risks of opposing Western dominance. The war is the narrative. It has never been only about uranium, or enrichment, or even the bomb itself. The real war is over narrative. It's over truth, sovereignty, and memory. It is over whose security matters. Who gets to define danger, and who gets to be called dangerous. Who is considered civilized, and who is treated as a threat. It's about who is granted the right to defend themselves, and who is criminalized for trying. And so we must say it plainly, nuclear weapons are not only tools of destruction. They are tools of division. Their power lies not only in their payload, but in their privilege. Because what we call non-proliferation is, in truth, preservation of a global hierarchy in which former colonial powers continue to dictate who lives under threat, and who lives above it. For Iran, and for many in the global South, the issue is not simply nuclear policy. It is dignity, sovereignty, and the fundamental right to control one's own future, without permission from those who once enslaved, colonized, and occupied them. Yet every time a nation outside the Western Bloc attempts to assert its technological or strategic independence, the world reacts, not with diplomacy, but with fear. They call it instability. We call it resistance. Remember, they call it proliferation. We call it sovereignty. Peace, under this system, is not a right. It is a reward, reserved for the obedient. Justice is not universal. It is selective, written in treaties that protect empires and punish defiance. But here's what they didn't expect. The world is waking up. From Africa to Asia, from the Middle East to Latin America, a generation is rising, armed not with bombs, but with truth. Not with missiles, but with memory. Not with silence, but with voice. Because the greatest weapon we possess is not uranium. It is perspective. To question. To resist. To rewrite the script. And until the world confronts the lies of nuclear apartheid, peace will remain a privilege, not a right. This is Liberation Lens, where we decode empire, reclaim sovereignty, and restore truth. Because peace should not be a privilege. It should be the birthright of all peoples. Stand with the truth. Challenge the empire. And reclaim the future. Because yes, perspective matters.
You have just seen the world through a different lens. Subscribe, comment, share, and help amplify voices that deserve to be heard. Until next time, keep looking deeper. Liberation Lens. Perspective matters.